Okay. Hello, this is the SIG release meeting for August 22nd, 2022. So let's see. Actually, I don't think we have any agenda items actually being listed at this point. But to recap a little bit for what we actually started looking at, now that Tina is here too, so that's kind of nice for her to join in. Tina and I had some conversations on how to kickstart the CI/CD pipeline, and in general, we were thinking of just leveraging what Linux Foundations actually has used. So let me see. Percent, right? So we kind of ripped that off from Crino, but it's basically this is generic Linux Foundations thing. So in general, if you're a Linux Foundation project, you're entitled to use this kind of tool chains that they have already set up. So we obviously have some GitHub pieces. You can create Jenkins. You can use the Jenkins masters, and then you build your own Jenkins slaves, and then runs through the pipeline. So nothing, and then they use Nexus mostly for repository. So nothing fancy or controversial, but then we can kickstart our CI/CD with this. Once we have a repo that we actually want to hook up our own CI/CD testing with. So one of the things would be seeing if well, I don't think it's anything controversial, but if anyone has any objections of using any of this regular tool sets from Linux Foundations.
No objection, but a question. So eventually we want to run these on a cluster. So that's kind of a lab question.
So this is for check-in CI/CD,
right?
And then so the second thing would be, do we have any? How are we going to get like lab resources and things like that? So once the CI/CD things, everyone is fine with using Linux Foundation, we can start doing this first. Then the next thing that we are in the middle of talking to team on is to leverage the Linux Foundation Edge lab resources. We have gotten in touch with their PT, well, they're not SIG, but then the PTL, if you will. Of Linux Edge lab resources, Lincoln. So we'll set up a meeting with him actually over the next couple of days to talk about utilizing their resources, which obviously being out of Edge, they already have ARM and x86 systems that are loaded on the Edge. Depends on where they're mostly hosted in UNH. Go ahead, on.
Thunder X2, that's a Marvell thing, right? I recognize the product name. So my question is, are we hosting all of this on ARM or x86?
We have to talk to Lincoln and see what we're getting. Okay. Obviously, we can make requests.
May I be included in that meeting or discussion?
Yeah, that wouldn't be a problem. Of course.
Since I'm representing Marvell. So
okay. Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, Sanju, go ahead.
Yeah. So Stephen, how are we planning to incorporate all the changes that would go into kept and config modules? Because kept and config, if you see, there is no release today. It just
that's that question for John.
So kept and config are built they're being developed in GitHub, and we do releases through GitHub. So there are releases on the GitHub repos for those. So, and I'm closely involved with that.
Yeah.
So I'm happy to coordinate delivery of builds or whatever we need to do to incorporate this with our whole overall workflow.
Okay, is there a plan to like fork it and use it within Nephio, or
we should not fork anything? So and this is going through the TSC's operating procedures right now, which I reviewed last week. Like many other Linux Foundation, we're like an upstream first project. Rather than forking things, we should be working with those upstream communities to provide them with requirements and to potentially help them implement those requirements. And so it will be likely largely fall to me. So I'm actually on the steering committee for KEPT. There's just 4 of us, but I'm one of the people deeply involved there in pushing forward, in particular, the CAD story, which we're talking about here. So we'll have a lot of influence in moving those products to meet our requirements.
And then for us, we obviously have to build a functional test bed where the new releases of CAP and Porch and things would be able to pull in and be validated before release process.
Correct. Yeah.
And those mostly will be running on cloud. So we also, in addition to the Unix resources, we will obviously need to get some sort of cloud resources. And that one, I guess, from Google's side, we'll try to work with our execs and see if we can get some GKE resources.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Ben.
Maybe it's a question based on the demo that John did before. If you look today, and this is an open question, just a thought for the team. Today we have like QBuilder and operator framework, right? That basically helps us to build controllers that generate a bunch of CRDs and what have you, right? If you look to the framework that John presented, we probably want to. Question is, are we not requiring additional tooling to basically potentially extract some of these CRDs out of these repos and add some kept functions related to it? Should we not think about tooling that does that also in the Nephio context? Because I think, John, when you set this up, you all did it manual, I guess, right? Extracting the repos and stuff like that. So there's probably a whole tool chain. I was thinking loud, so there's probably a tool chain required to make that more automatable.
So you're talking about the repos because you're not talking about the code repos for this stuff. You're talking about the repos that we're manipulating and as part of our tasks.
Mm-hmm.
Is that what you're saying?
So for example, typically today when you develop an operator, right, or a controller, what you do is you basically build the tags and stuff like that. You say, okay, I want these CRDs, da. Potentially, we also want to say, okay, we want these kept functions. I'm also even thinking that you probably want to extract, because you want to basically say, okay, here are the manifests that represent a certain, let's say, entity in Nephio that does something, that you're able to extract it so that we can actually pull that out and put it into the, let's say, Nephio framework and stuff like that. So I was thinking out loud that we probably need a bit of a tool chaining to do all of these tasks.
Yeah.
We could,
Go ahead, Tal.
we could probably, we discussed this before, maybe looking at Prow, which is kind of a fairly standard, Kubernetes-based deployment CI/CD thing. It's within that ecosystem. I always do this, but I always try to exert some counter pressure to John here. Let's be careful of not turning KEPT into a dependency for Nephio. I think it could be a great tool for us to move forward. But if the community as a whole says KEPT is a dependency for Nephio and this is the basis for the whole system, then sure, we're going to go there. But we're not quite there yet, I think.
That's why I'm saying we are. And my question is a bit ahead of the curve, but I potentially see, depending on how we go forward, that we need some tooling around that thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're gonna. So there's a few different questions embedded in there. One is, I mean, we're gonna have a lot of code, and we're gonna have a bunch of different repos. I think we made the decision a couple of weeks ago on this call that we're going to do we're not going to do a mono repo. We're going to have a bunch of different repos. So each controller, each operator will probably have its own repo. We probably are going to need, like, if you look at how Kubernetes has organized things, there's an API repo that just contains the API code, like the things the Go files you'd include, for example. We're going to be CRD based, so we're going to need a repo for those CRDs. So there's a big organizational question as to how we organize our repositories such that we can, not end up with circular dependencies and all this fun stuff. And I think that falls to this SIG for sure.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what that organization exactly looks like yet, but yeah, there'll be. I created for the POC a single repo to stick functions in, but we'll also need build process, the CI/CD process Stephen was talking about, to build those, push them to some artifact registry. It sounds like there's one available from Linux Foundation, some container registry. There's a bunch of tooling around all of that. Totally agree. And ultimately, in the automation SIG, we would hope that we produce libraries or tool chains that make it easier for operators to process, say, the Nephio specific CRDs. I don't want to create, this is not maybe the topic for this SIG, I don't want to create what I think I referred to in the past as like an inversion of control. I don't want to take control of the operators. I don't want to have an Uber operator that runs and Nephio controls and calls out to vendor operators. I want to invert that and have the vendor operators be primary, but they consume the Nephio CRDs. And if it's easier for them, if we've done a good job and created libraries that make us consuming those easier, they consume our libraries. But we need to give them the control to do things how they want to do them, as long as it meets our eventual validation suite, whatever that may be. So I guess I think I'm addressing your question, Wim.
No, Jordan, I think I just wanted to raise it as a topic. I mean, this is something that the SIG working group should work on. Probably too early to
Right.
do
So the real question is whether or not we should have tool chains that would make it easier for CLDs to generate CAP related pieces, or I guess
I mean, if you look today to a project of a controller, for example, right? I think you get to operator or KubeBuilder, you get a bunch of CRDs, you get customized files and the whole
right. Correct.
thing, right? So let's say that we standardize on CAP, so it's still TBD, based on also, but that means that based on that, you probably also want to, a bunch of tooling that basically also instantiates those CAP functions. Just to give you a sense, today, I have a bunch of projects I'm refactoring into a CAP mode, and I'm just trying to. What I see is that
The SDK sucks.
So a lot of the manipulations that you have to do right now. And so with KubeBuilder, you basically generate a bunch of things with customized. You can manipulate it. When you go to CAP, there is an additional set of things that you would need on top of what the ecosystem that we have today, right? Now, that's just a very niche example right now. But I think if I look to Nephio as a whole, there's probably much more required in that area. That's why I was just experiencing with myself. Right now, what I'm doing is manually taking out all these files and putting it in another repo. But I think going forward, that's probably not the way to do so, right?
Yeah, what I hear, Wim, is you're saying with KubeBuilder, with some other things, in controller runtime and all of these, we've sort of built up a set of tools for building operators. We, broadly meaning the industry / Kubernetes community, has built up this set of tools. It's an on-ramp and to building an operator. And we don't have our on-ramp for building, we're kept as newer. Porch is brand new, which is the sort of kept as a service running in the server. So we have like really paltry, a very bumpy, full of potholes on-ramp to that process, and needs a lot of work. Totally agree. I think I would love you to join in on our kept calls, which is right the underlying piece there, and we can start talking about how we can make that experience easier for people trying to implement things on top of it.
Yes. Sure. And then as John said, if that's required, that kind of falls into CAP's territory. It's probably less likely that.
Join the call. I think it's on Thursday at 10 p.m. PST, right?
Which thing? There's the SIG automation call. I'm not going to be. Tal's going to present.
No, the CAP weekly call. Or something.
The CAP weekly call is Wednesdays. It's a terrible time for anybody not in the U.S. West Coast. The CAP SIG call. There's a separate calendar, but
okay,
it's 3 p.m. on Wednesday. Yeah. There's a kept channel in the Kubernetes Slack. Ping me on there, and we can talk about it there.
On?
Quickly, John, it may be not appropriate time right now in this forum, but I'd love to hear more about that inversion of control thing that you had mentioned in passing.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, that's just a philosophy I try to bring to things. Like, I've done a lot of throughout my career. Like, we're in a position where I am kind of providing functionality to development teams, and what I've learned is when a central component like that tries to exert control, they just become a bottleneck. And so we want to, and this is not just me, right? I think it's common in a cloud native environment to try to empower your teams.
Right.
And this is the philosophy I want to make sure that we're careful to follow through with, is that our role as providing the tooling for helping vendors build and integrate with our platform. Our role should be to make their lives easier, and they should see an advantage to using our tools. And if they don't want to use our tools because they don't get some advantage from it, then that's us doing a poor job.
Yeah, agree.
So this is more SIG 2, but then I guess in essence we don't want to have like a meta Uber operators. We want to, if we have common pieces, which we probably will have, we'll probably present them as a common piece that operators have the freedom to utilize, instead of putting all the common pieces as a driver and then the operators are just plug in.
Yeah, I was hoping going toward that instead of the philosophical tool adoption side, which is the operator can become unwieldy, single point of failure or single bottleneck, versus intriguing the idea of having different company vendors have their own operator or whatever you want to call it, and then consume or invoke the Nephio SIG controller as needed. That just caught my imagination, and I'd love to learn more.
So a great example, I don't know how much you follow the Kubernetes community. This is a exact thing happened in the initial Kubernetes development. It started out with the cloud provider support was built into the controller manager. So if you need to instantiate a load balancer for your service, then you embedded in the service controller that was embedded in the Kube controller manager the sorry, I got distracted by David's message.
Yeah, me too.
Then we spent like 2 years or more actually disentangling that mess. And now you have a separate controller for each cloud provider. And, you know, there's no more binding there. And we don't get that central point where like the central Kubernetes upstream team needs to approve everything that every cloud vendor wants to do because it's in one place. We don't want to get in that situation. It's not sustainable.
Yeah, I love more examples, discussion offline if needed.
Sure.
It tickled my fancy, that's all.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Tal.
Yeah, so this is actually a very interesting discussion. I don't want to get sidetracked by it, but I agree 100%. There are lots of ways to talk about this. IOC, I use that a lot, inversion of control, or decomposition, right? So we have a problem, and it's our problem in general as a community that we keep telling people write operators, but and they do that, but then they create another problem where it centralizes all the responsibility in these operators. So decomposing those is part of, I think, what we're trying to do in Nephio. Probably a discussion we should have in the architecture SIG, not the release SIG, but it's a little bit relevant. But anyway, I think I want to backtrack a little bit to where we started on the agenda, where you know, talking about the repos. You mentioned this idea of maybe having an API repo. I'm brainstorming here, but one approach I'm thinking of is plumbing. So, for example, in the network part of Kubernetes, network plumbing, that's where they put all the CRDs and client utilities, etc., for network attachment definitions. But there's no implementation there, right? The implementation comes from something like Multis. That's the only implementation now, but there could be other implementations, network service mesh, etc. So maybe a nice idea for us is to also think of this in terms of plumbing. There's Nephio plumbing, and under plumbing, under that, we kind of put everything that's kind of the connectivity stuff in Nephio, for lack of a better term, right? So it's APIs, it's CRDs, it's client utilities, it's all the testing involved in deploying that and connecting it to others. It could be libraries, you know, Go libraries that you actually import to other places like the client part. And it can be complete operators that do something regarding those. So my proposal here, my brainstorming proposal, is maybe we can just call it plumbing, all of that together, and create a plumbing repo. And all of that plumbing stuff would go there. So kind of broader scope than just APIs, right? APIs is maybe too specific at this point. It might end up being mostly APIs, or it might end up being mostly other things, right? Because we might end up finally defining, you know, 2 CRDs for all of Nephio that we all agree on are filling in the gaps that we have right now. So there won't be a lot there, but it might be more in terms of really the connectivity and taking that decomposition that I talked about earlier, right? If vendors decompose their operator, and instead of having one mega operator to rule them all, they're instead delegating work to Nephio components, well, that plumbing repo will have the tools to do that kind of integration. Just brainstorming. Yeah.
I like it. Maybe Nephio runtime. Huh? You have a Nephio runtime or something like that. No, I agree. I think it's a good idea.
Yeah, I think that definitely can work, and we can always, like, you know, everything's a rough draft until we release it. So I think that's a great place to start.
Okay. Well, anyway, for us, we are, if whatever the repo actual breakdown is, or wherever the CLDs are pulled in, our job is to make sure that on release side, making sure that the testing and release process is actually in place. Or any integrations that needs to be done. If let's say you have a repo that holds just the high level intent CLDs, and then you have some which is a Nephio plumbing CLDs, that we have to make sure that they do work with each other, with whatever vendors are supporting.
So Tal, you mentioned Prow. So when when we initially made this SIG, I was thinking Proud just because I coming from the Kubernetes world, which is what we use. So, but then Stephen and Tina have been talking about the standard LF tooling, which I wouldn't.
Yeah, this is more like what's available. We're open to communities, preference to what to use, and then we can do a comparison.
I mean, I'm super familiar with Proud, so I'm /approve and /LGTMs on my PRs make me happy. But I also, doing it in GitHub, not in Garrett. I used Garrett back in OpenStack. We use Garrett.
OpenStack, yeah.
We use Garrett internally at Google for certain things, and I'm not a huge fan, but it's just a taste issue, not a reality,
Yeah,
not a functional issue.
I think as long as we have a loose coupling between the implementation and our CI/CD pipeline, we're fine with whatever we choose. If it becomes a dependency, then suddenly this SIG will have too much influence over the product as a whole. In the end, we're just trying to deliver that reference implementation. And I think if we choose what's most familiar to the people in the group and most comfortable with working, and I think that would be best.
Yeah, well, we should investigate it for sure. And then trying to see if we can get support to easily set that up and put it onto the pipeline.
Yeah, I mean, there's what's comfortable to the people doing the development. There's also what's comfortable to the people who have to support the CI/CD pipeline. And we don't have anybody that knows how to manage PROW as far as I know. And we do have somebody who knows how to manage the other pipeline. So as a practical matter, the rest of us, I mean, in some sense, you'd say it's better to, well, I don't know what other people are comfortable with. I just happen to be comfortable with PROW, but I also have used the other tools as well. So it's not a big deal. And there's plenty of other people working who may have different opinions. So I don't know how to answer that question. We could send a survey out like we've done.
Yeah,
that.
we can send a survey. And it would be good to get some volunteers in the SIG to see if they can investigate how to integrate that. Because I'm guessing in Kubernetes, there's the SIG release group that's actually working on this, right?
Kubernetes has I mean, obviously it's a
very big one.
big community that's been around for a long time, but it's got an infra community and a release community. So Nabarun, who's at, I think, VMware, he was release manager for a few cycles, at least one, of Kubernetes. And I think he did a presentation in Valencia on using PROW in your open source project. So he's somebody we could approach. I know him pretty well, to get more info on that. I think he'd be an enthusiastic proponent of PROW. Let's say that.
Okay.
So I can make that connection if you want.
Yeah.
I do want to point out that PROW or anything else we choose is only going to be half of what we need, because as I said before, and I suspect a lot of our work will be in the management cluster. So PROW will be working against that management cluster. But then there's the Nephio part 2, which does, if we have operators that do things, install and create a workload cluster, well, that's beyond what PROW does. So we're going to have to fill in those gaps with that part 2 with our own, basically, testing integration tools.
Yeah.
What this group will be working on mostly, I assume.
So this is another area. So we haven't, we're bleeding all these things together a little bit, but like one of the things we have to figure out, like if you look at my demo, it's all just about workload. And then Bernard brought up, well, what about infra, right? Mm-hmm. And I intentionally left it out because it's hard, and it's, you can only do so much at a time, but especially when you're just trying to illustrate principles. But we have, I think there's like four to five different infra level, and by infra here I'm talking about clusters, not clusters and nodes, node pools, not
Not like fabric or network connectivity.
yeah at this point. Although that happens too.
Mhm.
But in order to do our testing, we're going to need to instantiate clusters that represent workload clusters. We're going to have to instantiate repositories that represent the workload repositories for those clusters. We're going to have to hook all that together. Google has a solution for that for our tools, but obviously we don't have a solution for everybody's clusters.
Mhm.
Amazon, I believe, has AWS operators for Kubernetes or something that allows you to declaratively via KRM instantiate EKS clusters. Azure has a similar thing, and then there's Cluster API. So Cluster API is a Kubernetes project that, last I looked at it about 3.5 years ago, did not really focus on instantiating clusters. It focused on managing node pools in a cluster. I've heard through the grapevine that that's changed, but I have not looked at it yet to see. But if it does support instantiation of clusters in a robust way, that could be super useful for us.
It doesn't, unfortunately. Not a lot has changed in the 3 years plus that it's been running.
They've been working hard on it. I'm sure they must.
It's an extremely hard problem, right? But it ends up, Cluster API ends up being a lowest common denominator. So it's because you can't please everybody. I think it has some use for public cloud things where people need, get me a cluster on the public cloud and you can create some sort of interface. But the devil is in the details. I don't think Cluster API has much interest for telco because it's just far too lean in its features.
That was my yeah. Sorry, Ian, I know you've had your hand up for a while. My evaluation 3.5 years ago when we were doing GKE on VMware was we used an early version of Cluster API, and I said we can't. It's going in the wrong direction, honestly. The investment to make it go in the right direction, the political and techno-social capital, I like to call it, was too high. And it's exactly that. It looked like the way it has an inversion of control problem, at least it did 3.5 years ago, where it's becoming a lowest common denominator. And that was sort of the direction why I didn't want to go that direction. So yeah. If we still have that problem, this is one thing I want to avoid. And I guess we're talking still more of SIG 2 stuff, but one of the key things I want to make sure we're very careful about, both in the dimension of cluster instantiation, but also in the dimension of vendor network function instantiation, is avoiding that lowest common denominator problem. And I have thoughts about how to do that, but we can.
Yeah, just a quick addition to it. I think it's exactly that, the problem of control. One of the problems of the cluster and API, and one of the solutions that Nephio provides. Well, here at Nephio, we assume a management cluster that is running Kubernetes. That is an immensely important assumption, right? Because Cluster API has no idea that there's something that answers the API and does something, but it's undefined, right? But when you think of that something as a management cluster where you can extend using the usual operators,
right.
You can have your own things running in that management cluster and doing things that you need for your workload cluster. That assumption that I think we all have in Nephio is already a huge step forward, right? Suddenly we have this area which we can extend and work in, which we didn't really think of as a whole community before. So Cluster API doesn't give us that. We're on our own here.
Okay, awesome. Okay.
Oh well, for SIG Release, get the conversation back to SIG Release. On SIG Release, the creation of clusters obviously community agree upon which set of clusters we want to do, and we also have limited resources on hardware and what we can do. Obviously, we are not. I don't think we get an AWS thing for free. If you want to test that as your edge cluster. So I haven't talked to Lincoln yet. So I don't know what kind of things we're getting actually for our released site codes and what kind of things we can use. But then if we can use some of these hardwares, then we can, raw Kubernetes, Terraform, Ansible, something to set it up. We can do that. But then we are not. Obviously, it's not SIG Release's job to standardize CLDs to create clusters. So we'll have an interface for test requests, but then not that's standard. Go ahead on.
Thanks. So I work for Marvell. We have 3, 4, 5, a bunch of telco operator and vendors as customer and partner. And through our experience, interaction with them, they've narrowed down to 3 or 4 orchestration platform to use. And obviously the most obvious one is Kubernetes, right? And then there's requests for OpenShift, Wind River, Cloud Platform, Starling X, and Telco Cloud Automation by VMware. So I want to throw it out here for discussion. I'm not making a request or a firm stand, but beside Kubernetes, be it GKE, AKS, or EKS, can we consider the other 3 platforms as potential, not all 3, but maybe 1 or 2 or whatever, as potential testing deployment platforms as part of the release?
If the community had someone to work on it and then able to get the license for those software.
Yeah, if somebody.
Yeah.
Well, we do have a Red Hat dude sitting on this call.
Yeah, it won't be a problem to get OpenShift at all.
Yeah.
Licenses are available exactly for these things for free. But yeah, it's as Steven said, it's exactly what people work on it, right? So
Yeah, I'll have to work on that because I have to do that for my real day job anyway. You know.
Well, we'll probably cooperate on that because I have to do that for my day job as well. But
High five, Captain.
well,
Yeah.
well, here's the hope. You know, we have Canonical involved here too. You know, they were at least in the pre. Oh, you're still here. Yeah. So you know, there's a Rancher. There's, you know, VMware is involved as well. I think if
Padma.
if all of us participants, you know, do our homework and try to take whatever we do here in Nephio Release and do it locally in our own labs and try to duplicate it, well, that would be the downstream, and then we can upstream our feedback. You know, we want, of course, all of us want to make sure that this will run on any Kubernetes, right?
Yeah.
So that's the goal. So, but to do so, it won't be easy to have, you know, if we have those resources that we just saw from the LF Edge lab, they're not infinite resources. You know, an OpenShift cluster requires 6 nodes to do it properly, unless you're doing a single node OpenShift, which is a different kind of scenario. So I don't think we're going to have enough hardware space just to test every Kubernetes.
Actually, it's an excellent point about having our own lab downstream and then upstream the result or the resulting artifacts. If you guys notice, Thunder X2 is Marvell DPUs, and I have access to those. I'm building a lab for OPI/ORAN/Nephio, and I have a team of 10. So, but I need guidance.
Certainly, that would be amazing if we can hook up with vendor-specific labs.
Yeah,
using SIG Release software to push things over and create a cluster dynamically and validate that it works. That would
my
be great.
boss just sent me an email say stop going to all those ORAN specs and start focusing more on Nephio. So you guys are in.
Oh.
I imagine access to the labs is going to be extremely hard, though. There's a lot of partner specific stuff there. Like we have labs, but you know, even if I wanted to volunteer something, it would be very hard to get the whole community, you know, VPNs and everything to get it out. Yeah.
Well, the lab for access initially maybe just
at least for like CD type, you know, or validations type work. That would be useful.
Let's start small. Let's start with one Kubernetes distro, I think.
Yes.
And then see about adding additional ones. Of course, all would be great. All would be great, you know.
And if somebody can go ahead, sorry.
You know, the success of Nephio would be that would be the proof that Nephio is succeeding, that we have more interest from platform vendors like Red Hat and others, Canonical, etc., to actually validate Nephio, you know, CI/CD on their labs. So we would be lucky to have that problem eventually.
Yeah, I hope we get there. David, your comment, yes, we will eventually have to have some sort of compliance test because we want a vendor to be able to say my operator is my workload, my packaging is Nephio compliant. You can drop it into anybody's Nephio environment and we can manage it. I'm specifically interested in the we can manage it aspect. That's different than the it can run on the underlying hardware. That should be a discoverable, resolvable. Like by manageable, I mean you should be able to upload some tarball or whatever it is, and to Nephio, and it'll go, oh, you said you need this, this, and this, and your underlying clusters don't support that. You can't run this workload. You know, like that would be super cool as a management aspect. And so supporting that discoverability would be something I would expect out of eventually this project, the ability for us to do.
Well,
that's going to be interesting in terms of Ingress artifacts.
Yes.
Particularly given, if we're going to support multiple different packaging mechanisms, right? What is the Ingress artifact to that compliance test versus the egress artifact to that compliance test?
Yeah, so if you look at the way Kubernetes has done it, it's not nearly as pretty as what I just described, and then sidesteps all those issues you're talking about. So, because what they do is they say, to be a conforming Kubernetes, what you do is run this suite of tests with Sonobuoy against a cluster you craft by hand, and if you meet all those tests, you're good to go. You can now use the Kubernetes name, and I think that's fine for Kubernetes as it is. I'd like to do better with Nephio if we can. Like it's really TBD at this point.
Well, Nephio also has the network function vendors aspect, and we have to make sure that they're actually doing what
distribution, and then there's the function. Yeah,
are they compatible with a CLD version? It's supposed to. How do we know if they're really working?
We talked at one point in the Kubernetes conformance group about adding an ability to evaluate a workload. This discoverability problem. Take a workload and evaluate whether it only uses conforming APIs. Evaluate whether it will work on a particular cluster which implements certain sets of optionally conforming APIs. We never even were able to agree to define what optionally conforming APIs were, though. So we made very little progress in that. Mm-hmm. Sorry, I'm digressing. I'm off on a tangent.
No, I would imagine us is even worse because you're trying to see what the workload is supposed to do.
Yeah. So another, if we're looking at conformance programs, another one we can look at is Gateway API. So Gateway API has a similar problem in that it's an API, and then there's vendor implementations of that API, and that group has come up with. They had a smaller scope than Kubernetes, so they made more progress along the sort of lines I was just talking about, where they've defined a set of core sort of common denominator APIs, and then like a concentric circles, and they can validate a given workload, a given implementation of Gateway API. But I don't think they've made it discoverable yet. Like it's not. They're looking at it, and I've talked to them about it. Like the idea of making that automatically discoverable thing, so that you can do this sort of like pre-validation of, oh, you're trying to deploy this workload, but your implementation of Gateway doesn't support these 3 features that you're trying to use. You need to change your workload or purchase another implementation of Gateway. I think that's like we're talking like 3, 4, 5 years.
Yeah. Okay. Well, actually, that's pretty much what I have. So we're trying to make some progress with the Out of Edge folks, and then we'll also do CI/CD pipeline. And as John said, if we can hook me up with the VMware guy, we can try to see if Proc is really that easy things to integrate. We're going to be a Kubernetes house, right? So it'd be nice to get that going too.
Sorry, John, can you spell prow? Sorry, it's unfamiliar to me. Or
PROW, prow, like the prow of a ship. So it's
okay.
more nautical. It's more nautical.
It's another ship.
Kubernetes nautical terms. Okay.
so PRA was built by the Kubernetes community specifically to do better review, CI/CD management of GitHub-based projects. So now some of the features that PRA implements for the Kubernetes project are actually available in GitHub, like the idea of code owners. But PRA is what we use to enforce owners files, so I can say that, and you're allowed to approve changes to code in this directory, and Steven's allowed to approve changes to code in this other directory, and somebody else is at a higher level, they can approve code in both. It assigns, when somebody submits a new PR, it looks at what files are being touched by that PR, assigns it to a given individual, lets them /assign it to other people. Like, it has these commands in the GitHub comments that you can use. It's a bot that allows you to control it, and it initiates all the builds, builds them, runs the E2E tests, deposits the
Artifacts.
logs, the artifacts in a bucket somewhere, and then there's a UI that gets run that can read from that bucket. And
Cool.
most of it's all open source, but then there's some, for some I don't know why reason, there's like this horrendous test grid. If you go to testgrid.kates.io, I think it is, or maybe it's Kates, I don't know, I'll have to look it up. But for some reason, that individual UI is something our Google Enterprise people built, and I don't know if they just haven't taken the time to open source it or what, but it's not that it's very pretty. So anyway, the point is, a lot of it's open source. We could potentially use it, but it requires a specific set of knowledge to operate, and we don't necessarily have somebody with that specific set of knowledge to operate it. So it's kind of, you know, Stephen and whoever ends up being vice chair here, and the rest of us as the members of the community can help make that decision, but I don't know the right choice.
It's completely new to me. I'm barely treading water with GitHub, so you know, it's another learning curve if we adopt that. That's all.
Yeah, exactly.
Go ahead, Tal.
So we did digress a little bit here, but it is interesting. I just remembered an issue that I want to make sure that's on our minds. The point is that a lot of our real world deployments are going to be air gapped. And obviously our CI/CD system is not. You know, we're using GitHub, and of course all these public things that Microsoft provides for us via GitHub. And if we're going to use the LF Edge Lab, that's also kind of open to the world, etc. This is going to be later down the road, but we need to think that sometimes these management clusters do not have access to the internet, right? And that actually introduces many challenges, right? Because a lot of these installers, such as Cluster API, will assume that they can download artifacts from some public service, from some registry. I don't think this is a problem, at least, you know, for our lab work. But in terms of actually turning this into something real that telcos will be able to use, we have to keep in mind air-gapped deployments, and maybe we can actually simulate and test compliance for them even earlier.
Yeah, I remember Bernard making that point too during the summit. Yeah. Go ahead, John.
Two things. One is it gets, I don't, if you talk air gap, then the air gap, there has to be some, all of the infrastructure provisioning, by infrastructure again, I'm specifically talking about clusters. All of the cluster provisioning we've been talking about is cloud provider based. Like maybe there's an OpenShift air gapped service for provisioning clusters, but that's something we're going to have to address for those scenarios. The other thing I wanted to bring up as an aside, you just said something that reminded me. I just found out about GitHub.dev. So this is an amazing integration that Microsoft has done with VS Code and GitHub. You literally, if you're sitting on any file in any repo, you just hit dot, and it will switch you to GitHub.dev, and you can edit it right there in your browser like it's VS Code. I haven't like tried going through a full PR cycle with it, but I presume it makes life a lot easier as far as the whole fork and, you know, PR cycle. You know, that whole Git workflow, GitHub workflow around, I see a lot of, even just on the governance repo, right? There's been a lot of people accidentally submitting PRs to their own fork, things like that. It's super easy mistake to make if you've not used this tooling before. And so that's something to take a look at if you're annoyed with GitHub, github.dev.
Okay.
Yeah, I used it. It's fun. It's pretty heavy though, and probably not as fun as just using something locally. But yeah, it's another tool available to us.
Yeah. Well, it might be easier for people like I don't do a lot of code these days, so I just use VI. But like, you know, if you do a lot of code, stuff like VS Code is really, really nice.
It runs. It takes, you know, just from experience until it starts opening up everything, and because it's all JavaScript stuff, and it, you know, it runs in a VM that's provided from MS. Until it finally clones everything and get everything running, you probably solve the PR locally yourself in a second.
Yeah, Emacs. I used to use Emacs too.
Okay.
Start a war.
All right. If there's nothing else,
Very cool. Thank you.
thank you. Thank you for attending.
Oh, this is fun. This is the best part of my day. The last 2 hours.
All right. So next, for those of you coming to the SIG automation meeting, I won't be there, but Tal, it sounds like you've got some good stuff. I'm going to have to watch your recording.
Yeah.
So let's not forget to record, because I've done that.
Yeah.
So
I'll do that.
And Stephen, I'll have to get you. We'll either create a Nephio, or maybe Linux Foundation will come up with our Zoom account. If not,
I know. Yeah, it's amazing. Still not up and running.
yeah, I know. So I'll share my. We'll either get you a Nephio.org account, or I'll share you my stuff.
Yeah. It's probably time to get the Nephio one. Okay.
Thank you all.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Have a good one.
Sending your kids off, John.